Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the second session of our conference looking at ancient roots, new opportunities. And this session, we are going to be looking at future energy after the oil age. Although in discussion with our two panelists before we came in, I think a more appropriate title will be just the future, because it's not, of course, entirely about diversifying from oil and gas into other forms of energy. It's broader than that. So this afternoon we've got two experts to talk on this topic. First is Christopher Hopkinson. Christopher is first deputy chairman of Kazmunaygas, based in Kazakhstan. He has been in the energy sector all of his career, working for 14 years with Shell, then moving on to Russia for some time, where he worked with Lukoil, TNK BP before it was taken over by Rosneft, and also with BG, British Gas, in North Africa. And beside him, we have Stephen Geiger. Stephen is president, founder of Innova Partners. This is an innovation program working with oil-dependent economies, helping them to seek economic diversification. Stephen is no stranger to this part of the world. He was one of the co-founders and a director of Masdar, which is the UAE's alternative or innovation program, and a leading investor in future energy programs. Masdar was set up to help accelerate the UAE's transformation to a post-oil economy. Stephen also worked for many years in Russia, where he was part of the startup of Skolkovo, which is an innovation program set up by the Russian government, and has been very successful in attracting hundreds of technology startups, a number of R&D programs, and attracting other venture capital funds into alternative energies and other innovation programs. So both people very well equipped and experienced to address our topic. So let me start off, Stephen, give you the opportunity perhaps to give an overview of how you see the position right now with regards to energy, to alternative energy. What are countries doing? Are they successful from your experience? So let me give you the mic to you.
Thanks, Chris. We help different oil-dependent countries try to answer the question after oil, or the transition as oil becomes perhaps a less dominant global phenomenon. And I think you made a good point. These countries should not be looking to answer future energy only. It's simply, what are we going to do in terms of diversifying the economy to be competitive in other industries as the energy global mix changes away from hydrocarbons to a mix, and then at some point to largely renewables. Countries approach it from different ways, and I think the key here is to avoid the desire to try to find what we call the grand unifying theory of the universe. There is no single silver bullet answer for a country to transition away from its current primary activity in hydrocarbons. It will be a mix, and it will be over a time frame of decades. The critical point, I think, is to start it now, whether oil is $20 a barrel or whether oil is $100 a barrel. These transitions and transformations of countries and societies will take decades, and there's really not a lot of time to lose. Now here's the problem. When oil is $100 a barrel, countries get comfortable and they put change to the side. And then when oil is low, there's so much pressure for financial balancing the budget, things like that, that reform tends to be put off because people are looking for just to survive the short-term issues. So we try to advise countries to develop strategies where they can make a reasonable transformation to industries where they either have some core competencies, such as energy, or where their specific geographical location or talent base or other aspects allow them to have a reasonable chance of competing in certain industries, and then to develop those industries as they go forward. But I think the key message I'd like to get across is there is no perfect time except now to be developing what your post-oil transformation should look like.
And would you say then the UAE was the exception because it set up Masdar when the price of oil was high and was already looking at future energy projects? But
I think the UAE has done a fantastic job in diversification, and Masdar is just one element that required a lot of vision of the leadership. There are many other similar initiatives that are equally visionary. I was very fortunate to be able to help play a small role in building Masdar into a well-known name for the UAE in renewable energy. And this was a good case where the leadership focused on what areas of diversification of the economy they could play a role in, how they could take their existing energy expertise and leverage that energy expertise and those contacts into energies of the future. So we did solar projects, we did wind projects on a global basis, and that was a case point of the UAE being able to achieve a leadership position in one of the exciting growth industries of the future.
And Christopher, if I can turn to you, Kazakhstan, as we've been hearing all morning, one of the countries that's dependent on hydrocarbons is now suffering economically because of the lower price. What is happening in Kazakhstan in terms of diversification? Is there anything, or how do you see this kind of evolving in terms of the energy or the economic mix?
Well, I obviously represent the oil industry side in Kazakhstan, and we're heavily dependent not only economically but also from an employment point of view on the oil industry in Kazakhstan. And as Steve just pointed out, there's never a good time to start this transformation away from being so heavily dependent on oil and gas. A few years ago, oil price was high. We were making a lot of money. It was good for the country. And then there's no real incentive to start moving away. And now we're in a situation where the capex required to move away from a dependency on oil and gas is very difficult to find. And there tends to be a status quo, which is very, very difficult to break. My personal task as part of the transformation program that we have ongoing in Kazakhstan, that's sponsored through the Sovereign Wealth Fund, is to improve efficiency as a first step. But even improving efficiency of our large, mature on-field assets comes with its own problems, because efficiency improvements tend to employ less people. And we're a country that's heavily dependent on the oil and gas industry, as I said. And therefore, we are finding, although this oil price is good from an efficiency improvement point of view, our backs are against the wall, we have to change. We are in a situation where if we're going to become more efficient, we're going to have to find something for these people to do. And the catch-22 in all of this is that as the main workforce, and we employ 80,000 plus people directly, and then there are service companies attached, the main workforce are predominantly focused on the oil and gas business. The education system is predominantly focused on oil and gas. So I agree that it's not about alternative energies. It's more about energies that we can use the current skill sets to start moving into. Industries, that we can use the current skill sets that people are trained for, that we can start moving into, which probably initially will support the oil and gas industry.
Okay, actually, can I remind everybody to use the app if you have any questions you'd like to put to the panel, and also to remind you that the app is there also to give feedback. So if you want to make any comments or any suggestions, not necessarily questions, please use the app as well. And one question which has come in, and I guess it's more directed at the GCC region, but it applies to Kazakhstan as well. You both touched on the fact this is not just about renewable energy or creating a substitute energy. In other words, energy is still part of the discussion. There's this sense that countries that are currently very big energy producers and exporters can always remain big energy producers and exporters, even in a different world. I mean, is that realistic? If you've got big solar panels, and I apologize, I'm not technical, so my view is big solar panels out in the desert or I guess up in the steppes, the wind farms.
Wind farms. Yeah.
Is it even realistic to think about that as a source of future energy? Can you export that? You can't put it on a ship and send it off to the markets. Is it even realistic to talk about future energy other than for your own domestic consumption, but as an export earner?
I think we can break it down. It is realistic, but countries have to be clear-headed about what they can competitively produce and services as well as goods, based on what their competitive strengths are today and what are stretch goals for potential future industries. Abu Dhabi through Masdar went through this learning curve over the last 10 years and found that certain things were difficult to be competitive in, such as manufacturing of solar panels. We built a solar factory that, like every other solar factory, got crushed by the Chinese government policy of dominating this industry. And this is a case. But we found that project management, it's not just making things, it's the building of these power plants, it's the building of solar farms and wind farms and biomass. There is a lot of knowledge and skills that can be developed in the project development and project management that Abu Dhabi now possesses a very deep knowledge base of, that it is doing investment projects around the world. So it's good to try to figure out what you realistically can compete on a global basis head-to-head against large countries such as China and India, Europe and the United States, as well as the emerging markets. Some things are just simply going to be too much of a stretch. Some things are you don't have the capabilities today, but you build them. And I think, as Chris mentioned, if you look at countries that have traditionally done energy, well, that's a science and engineering education base that goes into these jobs. And there's no reason why that science and engineering base can't be transferred to other types of industries, such as IT or biosciences. So there are core strengths in education in these countries because of the oil and gas industries that they developed that they can leverage. They simply, our advice would be to be realistic in selecting industries where they can be truly competitive at some point in the future.
Right. Okay, I guess if we look at CIS, or perhaps we'd be best describing it as Eurasia region, as distinct from the UAE, which we can see has been very successful in retaining people and training people, etc. But across the Eurasia region, including Russia, the typical story is of bright university graduates, whatever, getting good degrees, and then either choosing or having to leave to go elsewhere with their skill sets because they can't get work, or perhaps don't even want to try to get work in their home countries. And Christopher, you talked about breaking the status quo. I guess this what you mean by the dominance of oil and gas or hydrocarbons. I mean, how do you break the status quo? Is it education? Is it time? Is it political change? I mean, what sort of revolution do you need to change the mindset in the CIS countries or in Russia away from hydrocarbons?
I think it is education. If I look at Kazakhstan, is doing an amazing job of sending young people abroad to study and bringing them back to Kazakhstan to help to build other industries, to build other businesses, entrepreneurs coming back into the country. But there's only so many of them going out there to train. I think that's one of the issues that Steve and I discussed earlier when we were talking about this. And the real challenge is to have enough momentum coming back in of people with good ideas who've been to places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi and have seen what can be done, and there've got to be enough of them coming back into the system to make the changes that are required to diversify and develop new business. And that's, I think, a challenge in many countries to find a way of doing that. These programs where we send people abroad to study are all well and good, but you've got 50, 60 students going per year. It takes them 3 or 4 years to study. They come back, and it's a very small virus coming back into the society that's trying to infect that society and change away from an oil-focused business. And you need that critical mass to be able to really make a change.
Right.
And if I could make just a comment on the previous question that Steve was answering earlier about changing across to a renewable energy, is there really a requirement to do so? And I think, if I were to look at the strategy, the 2050 strategy of Kazakhstan, which is, you know, a fantastic strategy. They're talking about being 50%, being able to supply 50% of their electrical needs by the year 2050 through renewable energy. That's an awful long way away. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. The message I'm trying to get across is that going to renewable energy sources is not going to push oil and gas out overnight.
Right.
Yeah, it's a very, very long-term change away from hydrocarbons.
Okay. But actually, when we talk about you know, hydrocarbon and the push to renewable, there is a different future, as it were, when you're looking at gas as distinct from oil. If we look at the recent Paris Agreement, which, you know, sets targets, etc., for emissions and pollution. I mean, gas still fits quite comfortably within that, as distinct from, say, the more polluting oil. So, in that sense, when Kazakhstan in particular, do you sense that the government is looking at gas development differently than oil, or is it just totally kind of preoccupied with the whole subject at this stage?
No, there's definitely a focus on gas, especially for the domestic market, for domestic power. Mm-hmm. It's recognized as a clean energy. We as an oil industry have got to conserve our gas as elsewhere in the world. So, you know, we are looking at a number of projects in the Caspian at the moment where a major focus is on ensuring that we have gas supply to shore for export and for domestic markets. So there's a strong recognition that gas is cleaner, and that's something that we are focusing on quite strongly.
Okay. Let me ask you an unfair question, and basically, how much time do hydrocarbon economies have? I mean, on the one hand, if we want to put our optimistic hat on, you know, and obviously, I think anybody who stands up and says they know where the oil price is going is obviously deemed foolish straight away. But if you look at the positives and you say, you know, the Chinese economy is still growing, even though it's slower than it was, but people are buying more cars. India is now growing at a better rate. They're looking at importing more energy, talking about the trans-Afghan Pakistan pipeline, for example. I mean, it still looks, despite the lower price, it still looks like there's probably a couple of decades at least before you have to start worrying about nobody wanting to buy your oil. Or is that wrong? Is it naive? Is it part of the problem? Or
I don't think that's wrong at all. I think there's at least a couple of decades. And I think, you know, I mean, you're looking at two things there. There's the demand and how long the demand will continue, and there's the supply. And, you know, people have been talking forever about the supply running out, and the reason where we're at today is supply is just continuing to increase. The world is awash with oil, and I think that will continue for the foreseeable future. As technology improves, we get better at finding it. And as we get better at finding it, then demand will be created, but not necessarily by putting it in your cars. There'll be other places other uses we will find for it, and demand will increase.
Right.
I'd like to add that it's not so much when people shouldn't be asking when the last barrel of oil is going to be sold. I think the bigger issue is when is the marginal barrel of oil going to lower the revenues for oil-producing countries below a level that they've been comfortable with. And I think that is not too far off in the future. If you look at the growth, the growth has flattened in Europe and America because of efficiency standards, even before the electrification of vehicles has even started. The emerging markets obviously are going to provide growth if they go a hydrocarbon route, which many in the oil industry think that is guaranteed. People in the renewable energy side, the electric vehicle side, the energy storage side, see the prices dropping on electrical storage systems so fast, they question when, and all you really have to do is impact the marginal demand to bring the prices down on a permanent basis to $30 and $40 for the foreseeable future. I think that if energy storage and electric vehicles penetration, particularly by the emerging markets, takes off faster than people in the traditional hydrocarbon energy currently assume, you'll see low oil prices in the future below a point which many of these societies are basing, shall we say, a comfortable life on. Okay. And that's a big risk. We'll get back to the main thing they can do now is to begin to identify this transition and try to place some intelligent bets. Education is one of the bets that they can definitely place. Chris was talking about the project in Kazakhstan where they send a number of bright students abroad It's very similar to the program in the UAE probably a decade ago, where many UAE citizens went abroad to educate themselves. Now we see first-class universities being built in these countries, in Nazarbayev University, for example, in Kazakhstan, and the many universities here in the UAE. So this is a way for them to transition. It's all about knowledge transfer. And this is a way to accelerate the knowledge transfer, is by building first-class institutes and research universities in your home country, as well as sending your bright students abroad to come back. I think doing both of those accelerates the knowledge transfer process.
Right. Can I remind everybody again, please, if you have any questions you'd like to send to the panel or any remarks, please use the app. And there is a question just directly related to what you were talking about, Steve. It's slightly different angle, so it's worth asking. And essentially the question is, what receiving, well, community, I guess, attitude is needed to effectively receive individuals coming home with new knowledge? And I guess that basically means is that if you send, your brightest across to universities somewhere outside, and they're trained and they come back, will they be able to, slot in? Will they get jobs? Will they be accepted? Will they be allowed to make a difference? Because far too often you do hear about, entrenched vested interests. People who've been there in CIS, of course, there's a lot of them from the Soviet times, and they're just not interested in giving even the opportunity for somebody coming from MIT. Is this an issue, or is this changing? I mean, is it a problem, or is it improving?
I think different countries have different severity of the problem. Right. In Russia, for example, many students go abroad, they study. Some choose to come back, some don't come back. The country is a very large country with a large population, so it can, I would say, afford this type of bit of a brain drain, because they're continually developing new brains. Countries with smaller populations, with less inherent technology or scientific education, I think they have to be a little more aggressive in retaining their brains and training even more. So I think it's dependent on the size of the country, the existing scientific educational systems in the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is population related. I mean, I know a number of students who've studied abroad underneath the program that we have in Kazakhstan, who have come back into my business and other businesses in Kazakhstan, and I think most of them have said that it was hard work getting back. Because they have a different knowledge base, a different education system. Many of them have gained some experience working internationally before they do come back, and the establishment can see them as being a threat to a certain extent. And I think that is one of the challenges, is to bring them back as part of a way of changing the way that we do our business.
Right. Okay. Well, everybody's here today to I guess to understand the region a little bit more, but also to hear about opportunities for investment. In other words, where they might be able to invest their money, or which industries, which sectors, which opportunities might be available. And across the region, if advising people, investors who are looking for opportunities, and bearing in mind the topic, not just about the future energy, but the future of CIS. Let's leave UAE out of it for the moment, because it's a more developed model. But across the CIS, where would you advise people in the audience to start looking in terms of what needs to be done, future development, and even taking into account we've been talking about all morning, the Silk Road, the transportation links, what that might do for energy tradability or opportunities as well. So, Chris?
Obviously, from my side, as I said at the beginning, we're looking at efficiencies. Yeah. And so, areas of investment for us are in the technologies which support the oil and gas industry becoming more efficient. Having said that, it sounds like something which is rocket science, but most of it in our situation is actually relatively simple, proved and tried technology. It's technology that Russia has been through that process over the last 10, 15 years. And in this environment, it's about economy of scale. It's about bringing in these technologies at a price which is still going to make sense. Right. The opportunity is huge. There are thousands of applications within Kazakhstan alone, so across the rest of the CIS as well. And really it's a matter of bringing it in at a scale which brings it down to a price which is going to make economic sense.
Right. And actually, before we go to Steve, just related to that, there was one question which specifically addressed that. Can efficiency in the oil industry improve or improve to be profitable at $30 per barrel? And if not, would it be not better to start looking at upstream processing, refinement, petrochemicals, plastics? Would that be a better area to look at rather than, in the downstream?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, in any vertically integrated company, you share the profit across the various streams. So, in a low oil price environment, your downstream sector is going to be making more money, and improvements in technology there are going to help. It also depends on where your starting point is. If as I explained at the beginning, we have an extremely efficient major 3 projects in Kazakhstan, which are world-class, 3 of the biggest projects anywhere in the world over the last 20 years. And then we have a huge amount of extremely old fields, which are 50, 60, 70 years old, that have been starved of attention due to the fact most of the attention was going on to the new big shiny projects. And therefore, there are huge opportunities to increase efficiencies in those fields, and even at this price, because they're onshore, all of the infrastructure is in place. The export routes are in place. So every dollar of efficiency you make is a dollar closer to being efficient at $30 or $25 or lower.
Right. And can I ask you about cash again? It's even at the current oil price, as soon as it's ready, it'll start pumping, or will the current price affect it?
As soon as it's ready, when it's on target to be ready.
To be ready later this year?
The end of this year still.
Okay, Steve, so I can ask you, yes.
On investment issues, I think realistically, investors should look at areas that are peripherally related to the core industries that they know and they feel comfortable and they feel competent in. Obviously, technology applications in the oil and gas sector. These are excellent, I think, areas to focus on, because you'll find that a number of the technologies have non-oil and gas applications, but you already feel comfortable with that technology because you're using that technology in your core business. For example, in Kuwait, as in Oman, they're now piloting projects that are using solar technologies to produce steam to develop their heavy oil industries. What can possibly come out of that is not only do they lower the carbon footprint of their core industry, oil and gas production, but they will develop knowledge and expertise in the industrial steam area, which is a very large industry to produce steam for various industrial applications through the use of solar. So by taking a industry that is peripherally related to your core industry, to me sounds like an intelligent way to begin to develop new industrial expertise.
Right, okay. Please also remind you that if you don't want to ask a question by the app, we do have microphones and the stands. If anybody wants to ask a question, please make that known, and we'll take it to the panel. One other question that's come in, asking for comments about, I suppose, government-created opportunities. In other words, laws, the availability of financing, tax breaks, other policies. Are they generally improving to encourage investment into alternative energies or kind of more diversifying industries, or is it still too early, especially, I suppose, in relation to Kazakhstan and other countries in Central Asia? Is it still too early to talk about those opportunities arising, or can we see something already happening that can encourage and entice investment?
In Kazakhstan, there are already things happening. There's a solar panel plant in Astana has been built. There's a wind farm has been put in place, generating. The plan is to generate 1,000 megawatts of energy from this wind plant. Oh, by the way, Kazakhstan is a huge country where 10 to 15% of the country has wind speeds of 6 meters per second on average. So it really is an ideal place for wind power. And this is one of the big drives in the 2020 and 2050 strategy. So, now I think is the time to start. If you don't start any of these things now, you're always going to be too late, as was mentioned by Steve at the beginning.
Well, the bigger issue is this should be an opportunity. What we're talking about is, can governments leverage this opportunity of low oil prices and the financial pressure of that to begin to liberalize their economies?
Sure.
So it's far beyond just renewable energies. It's, can these governments use this opportunity to have reforms that allow a more even playing field for different investors and
Sure.
for different entrepreneurs, whether they're domestically generated or whether they were sent abroad and come back. So I think this, I'm hopeful that this will be an opportunity that most governments do use to take this painful period of low oil prices to drive through, to have the courage to drive through what are inherently very painful reform processes.
Sure.
To liberalize their economies. That is the key to allowing not only their own local talent base to develop, but also to attract foreign direct investment.
Sure.
Nobody really wants to invest in a country where they see a lot of red tape, they see a lot of government regulations. And the countries that are successful in attracting foreign direct investment, as well as their own capital invested, are the ones that try to reduce that red tape and reduce those levels of regulation in their economies.
Right. No, that's a good point. And I think all three of us worked in Moscow in 2009 when we had the oil price collapse. And at that time, there was a great buzz about, reforms. It was the buzzword. And a lot of seemed to be happening on reforms in early 2009. And I remember I was at the deputy finance minister at the time, very frustrated one day in July. He said words to the effect, the oil price went up over $50. The reforms are all off the agenda. And he was so frustrated that he nearly made it, as it were. So that is the danger. I think,
That's the danger, yeah.
much as we know that the four most expensive words in the English language are, it's different this time. It's clearly much more serious this time around, and there is more buzz. And I think from just adding from the Moscow perspective, one difference in Moscow today compared to 2009 is that nobody uses the word reform. It's discredited as a word, as an idea. Instead, there's more attention being paid to what specific industrial policies can be adopted that can contribute to growth in the future. So I guess it's exactly as you were talking about, as the UAE has done, is focusing on what you can deliver on rather than just some conceptualizing reform, which really doesn't work. And actually, we have one question on that directed to you, Steve. And I think you possibly answered most of it anyway, but let me ask it. By having the oil price in the $30 to $40 for, let's say, the coming 10 years, will it be worthwhile and affordable for investments in renewable energy? Or does investment and the attractiveness of renewable energy matter what the oil price is? In other words, I guess we were just talking about this, but is this something that's now happening because of environmental, because of Paris, because of just general awareness, or is this a knee-jerk reaction, to the high oil price that made it worthwhile?
Actually, a lot of people in the oil community may find it surprising that the traditional linkage between oil prices and renewable energy development, that link has been broken, largely. Renewables are moving ahead. 2015 was a record year for both solar and wind in terms of global installations. And 2016 will go on and set another record, and so on. The technologies have hit a point. Obviously, Paris and climate issues are becoming more and more important as well. But the technology of these industries has advanced so fast, and the costs have dropped so fast that they are cost competitive for power generation and getting very close for transport with conventional hydrocarbons. And that's, to use the word tipping point, we're already there. And that process is only going to accelerate. Now, countries can decide, well, I'm going to still sit back and wait for the prices to drop even further and buy my renewable energy equipment 5 years from now. And the question that I usually pose to these groups are, well, what role is there going to be a seat at the table for you in 5 years?
Sure.
Today is the day to get in. And if you wait 5 years when everybody is in the game playing and you have no particular competitive advantage, the question is, are you even going to be able to compete in that industry? So the technology is dropping so fast, I don't really see that there's a lot of time to stand on the sideline.
Right. Okay. No, it's a good point. And we don't have anybody, unfortunately, on panels from Armenia, but it is worth mentioning what Armenia has been doing. Obviously, it doesn't have hydrocarbons, but has now for about 10 years been very focused on developing high-tech hub, biotech hub. I'm from Ireland, and they have modeled this program, a lot of what happened in Ireland. So big investment into education, and then tax breaks and other incentives, creating a high-tech biotech hub around the Yerevan area. And it's now 15% of GDP. So there is, if you like, an example within our area, within the Eurasia space, of a country, Armenia, that has done this, has invested the time, and it is working. It has worked. So hopefully, that's something that we'll see from being picked up from other countries. And Chris, there's a bit of a macro question, maybe a little bit, but I'll ask it anyway as it come in the app. And it said, how will the CIS states create a global identity, separate global identity, with Russia as its big brother neighbor? And currently, the questioner points out that the world still views the CIS states as almost second class to Russia, as dominated by Russia, with very little independent policy or identity. And they stress that this question is from an investment angle rather than a political angle. Do you think that countries in the CIS, whether it's Armenia or Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and of course we haven't talked much today about Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, or Uzbekistan, all of which are also a big part of the Eurasian Union, and Uzbekistan, the second biggest population, therefore long-term potential. So, taking that question, you think, or what will they have to do, maybe is a better way, to break away from being identified as former Soviet Union with that Russia link and be viewed as investable, separately identified locations? So I'm going to ask both of you that, but Chris.
Well, I think if this is a question from an investment point of view, and having spoken to a lot of investors through our program of trying to bring people into Kazakhstan to build their factories, to build their product within country and employ people, it really is it's about breaking away from the Russian/Soviet bureaucratic system. Even if changes have been made, what you tend to see is we have the same amount of tax inspections, we have the same issues with certifying goods coming into the country, we have the same issues with the customs, et cetera, which make it difficult to persuade people to come into the country and actually develop their product. An example I can give, if I bring in a particular diesel topping plant into Kazakhstan as a single unit, I would normally be certifying that with GOS certification, our version of GOS certification, as a single unit. If I try and persuade a factory to come in and actually construct this and build it in country, employing 500 people to make these things, I've got about 2,500 GOS certifications to do for each individual part.
Okay.
Which means that it's very, very difficult for the investor to come in. So it's very much a bureaucratic, it's the bureaucracy issue that needs to be solved to differentiate ourselves as CIS countries from Russia.
So it's a little bit of what you were saying earlier, accommodating this kind of new generation.
Yep.
With
people who know how to do it differently.
Yeah, bring them in. Steve?
Realistically, these countries were all one country. These economies were all highly, highly interconnected. And that is taking a number of decades to slowly change. And Russia is the largest economy of those bloc. And the surrounding countries that rely on trade, they do suffer when, for example, the ruble devaluates heavily. I think the auto industry in Kazakhstan has really suffered because they're competing against cheaper imports. So as Chris said, countries, this process of diversification of markets is going to take a while, but as Chris said, what countries can do is they can reduce the bureaucracy and the red tape to make themselves as attractive as possible. You can't control your neighbor's financial monetary policy, but you can control whether your country has a minimum level of red tape and bureaucracy and is very attractive to investors.
I guess what you're really saying is that a lower oil price for longer is probably better in terms of creating opportunities, because the need for those opportunities will be greater with lower oil in the hydrocarbon countries. Okay, we're just about to wrap up this panel, so I'm sorry, we do have a question. I apologize.
If I may, Nick Vinadze from Georgia. I represent a lead Georgian business law firm. My question, or perhaps a comment for this and future panels at this conference, and perhaps more importantly for future conferences on the CIS subject, would be when we speak about shifting the emphasis from oil and gas, and this is clearly my lawyer's perspective anyway, should we rather be talking about a global subject that permeates across the sectors, across all sectors, in fact, which is the rule of law. And I want to echo a speaker from earlier this morning who very rightly put, I think, that CIS as a concept is rather a phantom these days, and that is especially true, obviously, when it comes to countries like Georgia, who are no longer even there in the CIS. But I would still say yes and no, because CIS also is remains to be an important concept, because it denotes an important region, which is basically the former Soviet space, which includes Georgia as well as Baltics, if you like. And unfortunately, we've all come to this day, in the same boat of 70 years of voyage, which was defined by bureaucracy, to use your word, and thanks for reminding about that word. And to also add a couple more words, which are corruption and disregard for the rule of law, not to say a word about criminality. And unfortunately, these are the areas really, again, when we go beyond hydrocarbons and when we go beyond sectors which really prove difficult to solve all these past 20 years. But, at the same time, just like a very successful businessman from Georgia was telling us this morning, in my country's case, we have managed to prove in less than 20 years, in fact, in less than a decade, that, if there is will, then, these things can be defeated very successfully. And which simply means that, just like we've come in the same boat, we can stand together, and we can succeed together in defeating these things, And in Georgia's case, clearly this goes beyond the rankings. This is such a different place after all these reforms. So thank you very much for commenting on this, if we have time now, or, food for thought again for future.
Yes. Okay, no, thank you very much for that. And I do note that investors do pay a lot of attention to World Bank. He's doing business survey, Transparency International's corruption report, but also it is worth, I suppose, also reflecting the fact that the low oil price can put the sort of pressures on that can deliver change in those areas as well. And I would make just one reference again to Russia, where we've seen quite a number of state officials losing their jobs, and 28 governors losing their jobs. And it's not specifically a campaign against corruption, it's because they did not play their part in cutting wastage or stealing or did not do enough to rein in, if you like, the excessive spending. And it's not a corruption issue, it's a budget issue. And that's why it's now happening. But frankly, we'll take it any which way it comes. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for Stephen and Christopher for the panel. Please stay in your seats. The next panel is coming right up, and it extends a topic that I know there's been a lot of interest in all day, which is technology. So the digital Silk Road is the topic of our next session. And also, can I remind you of the gala dinner this evening at 7 p.m. So please also put that in your diary and stay for that. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Chris.